Before we begin, take a moment to let your shoulders relax, unclench your jaw, and breathe a little more deeply than usual. You've arrived at the Sleepless Historian, a quiet corner of the internet where stories from the world's oldest cultures are brought back to life not with blaring music or flashy effects but with care, calm, and reverence. In this ongoing series, we'll be traveling through the great mythologies of humanity. The kind of stories that weren't just written down, they were felt, believed, and lived tonight. As you ease into sleep or simply drift into stillness, we'll revisit tales that once echoed through mountains and palaces, temples and tombs. We'll walk with gods and kings, listen to the whispers of oracles, and uncover rituals long buried by time. Whether it's the fierce beauty of Norse sagas, the divine hierarchies of the Egyptians, the elegant riddles of Greek myths, or the earthy power of the Celts, each story we tell carries with it a piece of ancient wisdom and a touch of human longing. Here, there's no pressure to remember names or follow the logic of lore. Just let the cadence of the tale carry you. You're not expected to stay awake. In fact, the gods won't mind if you fall asleep in their presence. So wherever you are, welcome. You're among fellow wanderers, now those drawn to the old stories, told slowly and softly as they were meant to be. Let's slip quietly into the past. According to legend, long ago a son was born under a full moon to an ancient Indian king in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. This son enjoyed every privilege in life, but he was dissatisfied. Eventually, he left everything behind: family, wealth, power, and physical comfort, in search of true and lasting peace. After years of study and meditation, he finally found enlightenment while sitting under a tree, and he passed on what he had learned to others. That man was the Buddha. Throughout this course, I've been advocating for a relatively broad view of mythology, one that embraces aspects of what more commonly might be thought of as legend, religion, theology, and even philosophy. This understanding of mythology is at its most expansive when we think about the mythology surrounding the Buddha. And remember that by myth, I don't mean false or true. A myth is simply a meaning-making story, a narrative that provides an interpretive lens through which to understand human experience, the nature of the world, and the nature of the divine. It's a story with implications and significance beyond itself, a story that informs how we make sense of and live our lives as individuals embedded in specific cultural communities. The mythology of Buddhism does all these things, and it does so in several distinctive ways. First, it focuses to a large extent on one figure, the Buddha. We'll spend much of this lecture focusing on him. Second, since Buddhism spread so widely throughout India, Sri Lanka, China, Japan, and other parts of East Asia, its mythology is very diverse as well, reflecting distinctive elements of each culture. We'll come back to this point later. And finally, the mythology of Buddhism isn't found in any single epic, or even in any cohesive collection. Instead, it's better to understand the mythology of Buddhism as a huge anthology of short stories. Almost every individual story can stand on its own, and the stories don't necessarily speak to each other. But after you listen to a number of them, you begin to hear certain story motifs and themes repeated over and over again. We begin with the life of the Buddha. The myth tradition that developed around the Buddha focused on specific moments in his various incarnations, especially his life as a human in this age. Myths about the Buddha became part of the common folk culture in countries throughout East and South Asia, and they are absolutely essential parts of a traditional introduction to Buddhism. The most well-known stories about the Buddha describe his emergence in this age as a spiritual role model. They couple his life story with the basic elements of Buddhist thought and practice, culminating in the experience of enlightenment. Siddhartha Gautama was born into a wealthy Indian family sometime between the 6th and the 4th centuries BCE. The name Siddhartha means one who achieves his goal, but he didn't attract any special attention as a child or as a young man. He grew up as a prince in continual comfort, without a care in the world and without any awareness of human suffering, until one day this all changed. When he was 29 years old, married and a father, Siddhartha finally left the walls of his family's compound and rode through the streets of the city with his chariot driver Chandaka. They first came upon an old man. Siddhartha was astonished. He had never seen a body ravaged by old age. Chandaka told him that what he was seeing was not unusual. All human beings experience aging. Next, Siddhartha came upon a sick person whose body was disfigured and weakened by disease. Again, Siddhartha was astonished because he had never seen illness or disease. And again, Chandaka stated that all human beings experience illness and pain at some time in their lives. Third, Siddhartha passed a dead body. He had never witnessed death, so the limitations of the mortal body had never occurred to him, and he was appalled by the sight of death. Again, Chandaka told him that all human beings will die. No one can escape. Finally, Siddhartha saw an ascetic, a man dedicated to finding release from the human experience of suffering associated with aging, illness, and death by practices of self-denial, such as fasting and extended periods of meditation. Siddhartha committed himself to becoming an ascetic. This story, known as the Four Sights, is the foundational story of Buddhism. Now, there are some minor variations, but every version of this story ends with the sheltered prince relinquishing his comfortable lifestyle and dedicating himself to a life of extreme asceticism. In some versions of the story, he slips away in the middle of the night, not even saying goodbye to his wife Yashodhara or to his child, for fear that the sight of them would cause him to lose his resolve. Another version claims that the sounds of Siddhartha's horse hooves were silenced by the gods, so that no one in the palace would hear his departure and try to prevent him from leaving. As an aside, certain streams of Buddhism basically dismiss the existence of gods, at least any existence that affects human experience. Other streams celebrate numerous divine and supernatural beings, so don't let any reference to gods in Buddhist texts throw you. As the story continues, the former Prince Siddhartha first tried one path to spiritual peace, a path of extreme austerity. He became a beggar in the streets for a time, and then he studied under famous teachers. He first mastered meditation, but he didn't find spiritual fulfillment in extreme meditation. Then he mastered yoga. Again, he was left unfulfilled. He then tried extreme self-deprivation, living outdoors, eating only one nut per day, until he collapsed from physical exhaustion. Siddhartha mastered every ascetic tradition he tried. The legends teach that in every case, he was asked to become the recognized leader of each ascetic tradition. But Siddhartha found no spiritual peace in any of the extreme practices he mastered. Finally, Siddhartha came to believe that the best path to spiritual peace was what he called the middle way. The middle way involved a lifestyle of moderation, which rejected both self-indulgence and extreme self-denial. In effect, it offered a middle path between the life he had lived as a child, a life of pure self-indulgence, and the life he had lived as a young adult, a life of extreme self-denial. The middle path included meditation, but no extreme austerities. While pursuing this path, Siddhartha experienced the climactic spiritual moment in his life. Still seeking spiritual truth, he seated himself under a tree in Bodh Gaya, India, usually identified as a fig tree, and he vowed not to get up until he had found truth. After meditating for 49 days, he experienced enlightenment. The number 7 and multiples of 7 appear frequently throughout Buddhist thought, probably as a number signaling completion or fullness. According to the Buddhist tradition, Siddhartha's enlightenment began with a profound realization of our fundamental human condition, followed by discernment of the steps necessary to experience liberation. His understanding of the human condition is codified in the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths include an explanation for suffering and a pathway toward enlightenment. Specifically, the Four Noble Truths include 4 points that build on one another. First, the common human condition is fundamentally one of suffering. Second, this suffering arises from our desires. We all want things that we can't have or that we can't hold on to permanently. Third, suffering will come to an end when we cease to desire things. And fourth, there's a method to cease all desiring. Then Siddhartha outlined a method for ceasing all desiring known as the Eightfold Path. Now in brief, the Eightfold Path teaches the practices of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, and right mindfulness, which culminate in a practice of right concentration or right meditation. And observing this Eightfold Path leads to liberation. Ultimate liberation is called nirvana, and nirvana is experienced as complete freedom from any sense of attachment to things, to other people, to this world, even to a sense of one's own individual identity. Nirvana is the perfect realization of our true condition in the universe, and it's experienced as perfect bliss. Experiencing this makes someone an enlightened being, and Siddhartha Gautama was the supreme enlightened being. From the moment of his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he became known as the Buddha, a title meaning the enlightened one or the awakened one. You can see that the core teachings of Buddhism can be very abstract, but in Buddhism, they're conveyed through a few simple stories about the Buddha, and this is a key characteristic of Buddhist mythology. It takes complicated or abstract ideas and principles and presents them in story form. The first set of stories focus on the Buddha's experience, since he is the preeminent model of spiritual enlightenment. Subsequent stories in the Buddhist myth tradition focus on the Buddha's nature as a wise teacher. For example, there's a story in Japanese Zen Buddhism about a woman named Kisagutami whose young son died. According to the story, Kisagutami carried the dead boy's body around in her arms for days, wandering from house to house, sobbing and begging for help. Eventually, she was directed to a wise man, the Buddha in disguise. The Buddha told her that he could revive her dead son, but only if she brought him mustard seeds from the house of a family that had never experienced any loss. Kisagutami began to scour the countryside for these mustard seeds, but she couldn't find a single household that had not experienced sadness or death. And eventually she realized that her condition was not unique. All of human life involves loss, and at this moment she experienced enlightenment. This story, of course, teaches a simple lesson, conveying one of the fundamental beliefs of Buddhism: all life involves suffering. But it also functions at the level of myth, telling us something about the Buddha as a teacher and about the nature of human existence in story form. In the story, the Buddha didn't simply tell the woman about human suffering, and he didn't give her a long lecture. Instead, he sent her on a quest in which she discovered this truth on her own. And so the story conveys Buddhist values as well as a brief character sketch of the Buddha in one simple episode. And it passes on a philosophical point that has implications for the listener. Other Buddhist story traditions highlight the Buddha in his other lifetimes. According to Buddhism, creatures are not limited to one lifetime. We all experience multiple lives, reincarnations in different bodily forms. The Buddha has the special ability to remember all of his past and his future lifetimes, and countless stories describe him in these lifetimes in both human and animal forms. In all of these forms, the Buddha exhibits Buddhist values and morals, and he often helps lead others on the path to enlightenment. One collection of stories, known as the Jataka or birth tales, describes the Buddha's previous lives and the lives of other enlightened beings. These stories largely originate in India around the 4th century BCE. There are different streams of tales that come out of individual regions in India, but they all claim to present biographies of the previous lives of the Buddha. They read like Aesop's fables, including talking animal characters and straightforward morality lessons. Some of them are very simple. For example, in one Jataka story, a king's gardener lures a special wild deer into the palace walls, using sweet honeygrass to entice him. When the king sees the deer, he declares that the deer has been captured not by the gardener, but by the deer's own cravings. The king then releases the deer back into the wild, emphasizing how dangerous sweet cravings are. The story ends with the moral: it is better to eat in order to live, rather than to live in order to eat. Eating in this story is a metaphor for any desire, and the story is designed to teach a fundamental Buddhist truth. Desire for things in this world will lead to suffering and spiritual entrapment. Now, other tales are longer and a bit more complicated. Structurally, they often employ the nesting technique that we've seen in the Hindu-Indian literature. For example, in one myth, the Buddha praises a host for his hospitality. The host had entertained the Buddha and a group of monks who came to his door, a common practice in certain Buddhist cultures. The host took them in, and the Buddha offered a story out of gratitude, a story called The Rabbit in the Moon. The Buddha's story goes as follows. Once upon a time, an enlightened being was born as a rabbit. The rabbit had 3 friends, a monkey, an otter, and a jackal. They lived together, and the rabbit, being the wisest of the 4, taught them all how to live moral and virtuous lives. One day, the rabbit realized that it was the day of the full moon, and he reminded his friends to be prepared to offer food to the beggars, who would soon come to their homes as part of the traditional full moon practices. The otter found fish that a fisherman had caught, and the otter stole those fish and put them aside. The jackal took a roasted lizard and a pot of curd from someone else's hut. The monkey took mangoes from a mango grove, and each went home thinking he had been virtuous. The rabbit, however, upon determining that he had no food to give, decided that he would offer his own flesh as food. Saka, a famous enlightened being, decided to test each animal. He disguised himself as a beggar, and he asked each animal for food. He went to the otter, and the otter offered him the fish that he had taken from the fisherman. Then Saka went to the jackal's den. The jackal offered him the lizard he had taken from the man's hut. Then Saka went to the monkey, who offered him mangoes from the mango grove. Finally, Saka went to the rabbit's home, and when Saka asked for food, the rabbit freely offered to give him his own flesh. The rabbit asked Saka to kindle a fire, and then he promised, "When the fire is burning, call me, and I will gladly jump into the flames. When my flesh has been roasted, you may eat of my flesh." Saka built a fire, and then he called the rabbit, who jumped into the burning coals. Surprisingly, the rabbit did not die. Not a single hair on his body was burned. The rabbit, astonished, turned to Saka and asked what was going on. Saka revealed his true identity as an enlightened being, and he declared that he would make the rabbit's willingness to sacrifice himself known throughout the world. Then he inscribed the rabbit's image on the face of the moon as an enduring sign of the rabbit's virtue. As the story of the rabbit ends, we move back to the story it's nested in, the story of the Buddha and his host. When the Buddha finishes telling the story of the rabbit, he then confides to his host that he himself, the Buddha, was the self-sacrificing rabbit in a past life. Stories like this one work on a number of levels. They teach Buddhist values, and they also tell us several things about the Buddha himself. We learn about one of the Buddha's past lives and about his selfless nature. We also learn about the Buddha as a teacher. He draws on experiences from his different lifetimes to teach people in this age. He's not only the self-sacrificing rabbit, but also the wise elder who teaches abstract concepts such as selfless giving through simple animal stories through easily understood folk tales. Finally, we learn that the host who welcomes monastics who come to his door is looked upon favorably. So this is a bit more complicated than a simple one-dimensional morality fable. On another level, Buddhist mythology pits Buddhism against other Indian religious traditions. The story of the goat who laughed and wept describes a goat who was about to be sacrificed in a traditional Brahmin feast. Now, Brahmins were and still are the upper caste in Indian society, something akin to our highest social class. They are also the priestly class, which in ancient times meant that they were well educated in the sacred texts, and they performed traditional sacrificial rituals. The Buddhist tradition challenged many fundamental elements of ancient Hinduism, including the sacrificial ritual tradition, the caste system overall, and the Brahmins in particular. So many Jataka tales are structured to correct what Buddhism saw as faulty Hindu thought and practice. As the story goes, the goat was prepared for ritual slaughter, but then the goat himself unexpectedly began to laugh and then to cry. When the priests who were about to sacrifice him asked why he laughed and then cried, the goat explained that he had once been a Brahmin priest himself, and he had sacrificed a goat. Because of that act, he had been reincarnated as a goat himself 499 times previously, and he'd been sacrificed in each reincarnation. I laugh, he explained, because this time, the 500th time I have my head cut off, I will be released. But I cry, because you, as my sacrificers, will now enter my misery. The Brahmin and his students released the goat. Shortly after that, the goat's head was cut off by a freak act of nature. The story says, the moment the goat was set free, it reached out its neck to graze on the leaves of a bush growing near the top of a rock. At that very instant, a thunderbolt struck the rock, breaking off a section of rock, which hit the goat on its outstretched neck and tore its head off. The former priest's soul was released from its incarnation as a goat, and the Brahmin and his students did not incur the guilt of sacrifice. A story like this one clearly contrasts Buddhism with the ancient Indian religious tradition of animal sacrifice. It teaches that Buddhism, with its commitment to foregoing violence, is superior. It suggests that the universe is not driven or upheld by sacrifice. Instead, sacrifice leads to multiple rebirths. The obvious implication is that the listener should stop performing traditional sacrifice right away and follow the Buddhist path instead. Many of the Jataka tales present the superiority of Buddhism in simple story form. In addition, there are stories that pit one stream of Buddhism against another stream. And this brings us back to a key point I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. Buddhism evolved in various forms at different times and in different places throughout South and East Asia. For example, Tibetan Buddhism, known to most Westerners through the life and teaching of the Dalai Lama, is very different from the monastic version of Buddhism you find in Sri Lanka. And these traditions are both very different from the Zen Buddhist tradition found in East Asia. The different forms of Buddhism that evolved didn't always get along with one another, and the myth tradition that developed around the Buddha became a place where different streams of Buddhism could duke it out with one another. For example, the story of Kisugatami, the woman who had lost her son, presents the Buddha as someone who teaches indirectly through each person's life experience, and it presents a form of Buddhism available to the commoner, to the everyday person. This reflects the priorities of Mahayana Buddhism, the broad category of Buddhism that includes Zen Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism, which literally means the greater vehicle form of Buddhism, positions itself as distinctly different and more inclusive than the monastic stream of Buddhism that emphasizes lifelong study of Buddhist doctrinal texts over immediate experience. Stories of the Buddha were developed as kinds of endorsements of specific forms of Buddhism. In addition, since Buddhism spans multiple continents and multiple centuries, there's a lot of variation in Buddhist mythology, reflecting local beliefs and practices that commingled with Buddhism as it moved from region to region. It's actually quite striking to see just how many forms of Buddhism exist. For example, early Buddhism flourished in India, where it incorporated local Hindu gods, goddesses, and even demons, but also Indian motifs. One key figure in Indian Buddhism was the enlightened being Amitabha, who was born from a lotus flower, a classic image in Indian mythology. Amitabha was said to help others gain enlightenment when they worshipped him and spoke his name out loud, another feature of Indian thought. Ancient Indian thought believed that simply pronouncing names and words was powerful. In China, Buddhism looked different. Chinese Buddhism came to include numerous gods and organized them in a very complicated hierarchy, much like a government bureaucracy. This hierarchy included the kitchen god, as well as the familiar round-bellied Lasing Buddha, an enlightened being sometimes associated with Maitreya, the next form of the Buddha expected to come to this age, expected to come when the teaching and observance of the Dharma have been completely forgotten. Maitreya is recognized as the future successor to Gautama Buddha in all streams of Buddhism, but he's portrayed differently in distinct communities. The wide-ranging stories and images of the Buddha from across multiple geographic regions, multiple time periods, and multiple cultural communities are a good reminder to us that mythological traditions evolve over time. One figure, such as the Buddha, can look radically different from one culture to another. This is true across virtually every body of mythology. It's easy, for example, to think of Osiris as a static Egyptian figure, but we know that the Osiris of Cleopatra's time had accumulated meaning in mythology that the Osiris of the pyramid texts did not. When myths persist, they change and evolve, reflecting the cultural homes they find. We find this dynamic in the mythology of the Buddha. The mythology of Buddhism, however, isn't limited solely to stories of the Buddha. It also includes stories of other divine figures, all of whom contribute to the spread of Buddhist thought and practice. For example, there are also female deities in certain streams of Buddhism. Perhaps the best known is the goddess Tara, who appears in various forms in Tibetan, Chinese, and Japanese Buddhism. One Tibetan Buddhist tradition teaches that Avalokiteshvara, a well-known and preeminent enlightened being, was moved to tears one day by the suffering endured by all sentient beings. The teardrop that fell from his left eye landed on the earth and formed a lake, from which emerged a lotus flower. The lotus flower bloomed and revealed the goddess Tara inside. She encouraged him to pray, and she offered to be his partner in intercession and in his efforts to release all beings from suffering. She's widely known as the goddess, the mother of liberation, a goddess of compassion and healing. Despite the differences between Buddhist mythologies in different regions around the world, certain themes persist. These themes, the presentation of the Buddha as the supreme spiritual role model and teacher, the acceptance of human suffering, reincarnation and karma, and the ultimate goal of spiritual liberation, all of these themes permeate Buddhist mythology. Let me close with one final story about the Buddha. As the supreme enlightened being, the Buddha was able to choose when he died, that is, when he left his physical body. According to tradition, he chose to leave his body at the age of 80. He ate a meal offered by a devotee and became ill. His host became afraid that the meal had poisoned him, but the Buddha claimed that the meal had nothing to do with his impending death. Before allowing his body to die, the Buddha asked if any of his followers had questions. When he was satisfied that there were no remaining questions, he left his body and entered parinirvana. Now this is the supreme state of final nirvana, which can only be reached by someone who has attained complete enlightenment. This person is free from all karmic ties and any future rebirths. It's a realm of eternal bliss. There are various interpretations of what actually happened with this meal. Some traditions teach that the Buddha ate uncooked pork. Others argue that he ate a poisonous mushroom. And still others believe that his death had nothing to do with the food at all. The key from a Buddhist perspective is that the Buddha was in complete control of the moment of his death. As a completely enlightened or awakened being, he chose when to leave his body. Traditionally, Buddhism teaches that his final words were, "All composite things are perishable. Strive for your own release with diligence." The idea here is that we should strive to be released from the illusion that anything is permanent, even the sense that we ourselves are permanent. The Buddha's body was cremated, but various relics are said to be enshrined at several religious sites. For example, the Temple of the Tooths in Sri Lanka claims to house the Buddha's tooth. But from a Buddhist perspective, the most important thing the Buddha left behind was the Sangha, the community of followers that would transmit his teaching. There have been ups and downs in the history of this community, and each stream of Buddhism understands the nature and the significance of the Sangha differently. A strict definition of Sangha limits it to monastic communities who have taken specific vows. A broader definition includes all Buddhist followers within the Sangha. The key for us is that all Buddhist communities, no matter how they define themselves, trace their roots back to that first myth, the story of a young prince riding in a chariot 2,400 years ago, seeing sights he had never seen before. Imagine yourself living at a turning point in the life of the world as you know it. One age is ending and another age is beginning. You begin to realize that the world you grew up in, its history, religion, government, social fabric, even its very language, is fading away, and your grandchildren will never know this world. The things you feel at home with are gradually becoming obsolete and arcane. What would you do if you suddenly felt that happening to your entire society and way of life? In the 11th century, a Persian poet known as Hakim Abul Qasim Ferdowsi Tusi tried to express this very position in his epic poem, the Shahnameh, better known as the Persian Book of Kings. This epic poem, originally nearly 60,000 couplets, over 3 times as long as the Iliad, became the most famous work of Persian literature known to the world. Today it is widely regarded as the national epic of the worldwide Persian-speaking community. Ferdowsi was born into a landed aristocratic family near the city of Tus, located in what is now northeastern Iran. Tus was a major city in Ferdowsi's day, rich in Persian culture. Ferdowsi wrote in Persian when modern Persian was being infiltrated with Arabic words, and when Arabic threatened to replace Persian as the preferred language of literature. Ferdowsi was a Muslim and he knew Arabic, but he was first and foremost a native Iranian with family ties to classical Persian culture. Specifically, Ferdowsi came from a family that held the status of landed gentry or farmers. He took great pride in his local family identity and his Persian cultural heritage, and this is evident in the Persian he used to write the Shahnameh, a form of Persian without a lot of Arabic included. Before we get into the story of the Shahnameh, a brief aside about terminology. Properly speaking, Iran is the official legal name of the country, formally instituted in 1935. But people often use the names Persia and Iran interchangeably. The country of Iran has roots that go back literally thousands of years. Some say that Iran as an empire has existed in some form since at least the first millennium BCE, if not earlier. For our purposes, I'll use the term Iran to refer to the empire, with the understanding that Persian as an adjective refers more broadly to cultural elements that may go back to the 2nd or even the 3rd millennia BCE. According to scholars, Ferdowsi began the Book of Kings in 977 CE. Legend has it that he undertook the work at age 36 in order to raise money for his daughter's dowry. An apocryphal story states that Ferdowsi was hired at the rate of 1 gold coin per couplet. When he began the poem, the region Ferdowsi lived in, what we think of as eastern Iran today, was still under the control of a group that valued its Persian heritage. But by the time Ferdowsi completed the poem, 33 years later, on March 8, 1010, eastern Iran was under the control of the Ghaznavids, a powerful Muslim dynasty of Turkish origin that gradually took control over a vast expanse of Central and West Asia. In fact, evidence suggests that these changes that influenced Ferdowsi began centuries earlier with the 7th century Muslim conquest of regions of Persia. It's important to note, however, that the Shahnameh should not be thought of as an accurate historical work. Fiction mingles freely with fact in this work. The Shahnameh includes references to historical kings and figures who really lived in Iranian history, but it's also full of mythical creatures, and key characters often are endowed with magical powers. As a result, it's best to think of the Shahnameh as an epic-length anthology of legends about the kings and heroes in Iranian history, whose stories the author has taken some liberties with in order to celebrate Persian history and culture more broadly. The epic is divided into 3 main sections, one that describes a mythical age, one that describes a heroic age, and one that describes a historical age. Over the course of these 3 sections, Ferdowsi traces 50 generations of Persian kings, from the creation of the world up to the death of the last Sassanid ruler and the Muslim conquest of Persia in the 7th century CE. The mythical, heroic, and historical material weave in and out of each other, creating one epic literary masterpiece, a national epic that captures history and mythology simultaneously. Ferdowsi opens the Shahnameh with an introduction praising Allah and describing the creation of the universe. But the meat of the epic is a chronological narrative describing the reigns of the 50 kings, and the treatment of the kings is a bit uneven. For example, the discussion of King Qaus, who purportedly ruled over Iran for 150 years, covers over 3 volumes of the standard 9-volume edition of the Shahnameh. Now, this is particularly interesting because Qaus is a bad king. He provides an object lesson in what not to do as king. In addition, the book spends a lot of time on figures who are not kings but rather heroes. In fact, it would be more accurate to title this epic The Book of Kings and Heroes. In part, this is because the heroes are featured as prominently as the kings are, and frankly their adventures are more interesting. The lives of the kings are also so intimately intertwined with the lives of the heroes that you can't really separate one from another. In this lecture, I want to focus in particular on a couple of heroes and kings, beginning with the hero Rostam of Sistan, who takes center stage in the 2nd major section of the Shahnameh. That section focuses on the age of the heroes and recounts stories about men who are viewed as the key figures in Iranian ancient history. This material takes up 2/3 of the epic. The Book of Kings describes 4 dynasties that span the period between the creation of the world and the Islamic conquest. Rostam is born at the dawn of the 2nd dynasty, the Qayanid dynasty. Rostam helps to establish the first king of the Qayanid dynasty on the throne of Iran, and he then serves that king's son and successor, Kai-Qaus. Kai-Qaus is proud, impulsive, and a bit foolish, but Rostam serves him loyally. Tragically, this leads to the death of Rostam's own son, and the story of this loss is worth examining in detail. According to the myth, Rostam impregnates another king's daughter during one of his journeys, but Rostam doesn't marry this woman. Instead, he continues on his travel. As we've seen, this isn't unusual for heroes in various cultures. Rostam's son, Sohrab, is born and raised in his mother's family. When Sohrab becomes a young man, he learns that Rostam is his father, and he sets out to depose the king of Iran, that is, Kai Khosrow, with the goal of putting Rostam on the throne instead. King Afrasiab encourages Sohrab to attack the king of Iran, but he has his own plan. King Afrasiab understands the role of a hero as one who supports his king. Rostam, as a loyal advisor, will fight on the battlefield defending the king of Iran. Afrasiab hopes that Rostam's son, Sohrab, will kill Rostam on the battlefield, conquering Iran and opening the way for Afrasiab himself to take the throne of Iran. Afrasiab sends a message to the king of Iran designed to provoke him to war. As expected, the king responds in anger, and he sends a message back to Afrasiab declaring, "Accept your subordinate status and so save your skin. You know well enough that Iran is my land, and that the world trembles before my might. No matter how brave a leopard may be, it dare not confront the lion's claws." This arrogant statement enrages Afrasiab. Tensions escalate into war, and eventually, Rostam is forced to fight Sohrab man to man. They are evenly matched, and Rostam only defeats Sohrab by resorting to trickery. At one point, Rostam gets the upper hand. The poem says that Rostam drives a blade into his own son's heart, not knowing whom he's killing. Once Sohrab realizes that he's dying, he reveals himself to his father. He explains that his mother gave him a gift when he was a young man, a memento of his father, an armband. She had hoped that Sohrab would use the armband to identify himself to his father and to bring about a happy reunion. Instead, Sohrab had hidden the armband under his armor out of sight. As Sohrab lies dying, Rostam tears the clothing from his son's body, and he sees the band. He sends a messenger to the king, Kai Khosrow, begging for a healing potion to save his son's life. He orders the messenger to tell the king, "Tell him what has befallen us, how with my dagger I have pierced my own son's heart. If he has any memory of my past deeds, then let his heart be moved for a little on my behalf. I ask for him to send me, without delay, a portion of that healing potion that he keeps in his storehouses for healing injured bodies, mixed with a cup of wine. It may be that by the virtue of the king's power, Sohrab may recover." Rostam's king receives the message, but he refuses to send the healing potion, declaring that if he did, he would be nurturing his own enemy. Sohrab dies, and when Rostam returns to his own camp, his men cheer his military victory, but he stops them, declaring that he has killed the person most dear to him in all the world. According to sources outside the Shahnameh, Afrasiab, the king who sent Sohrab into battle, is eventually defeated himself. He dies later, alone and miserable, hiding in a cave, traditionally believed to be on a mountaintop in Azerbaijan. Rostam is an intriguing figure. He's simultaneously an insider and an outsider. He comes from a family of advisors to kings, so he's part and parcel of the royal world. But he himself is not a king, and he never will be. He's also distinct from other normal men. He and his father live long lives, roughly 500 years each. He's descended from an archdemon or a div on his mother's side, so he's part demon himself. And all of these elements combine to mark him as an extraordinary being, a prototypical hero. Noble commitments determine his behavior, as the story involving his son Sohrab reveals. And in many ways, Rostam is superior to the kings he serves. He's not perfect by any stretch, none of Ferdowsi's heroes are, but he's a role model for the poem's audience at the same time that he's clearly marked as unique. In another section of the epic, Rostam embarks on a series of famous adventures known as the Haft Khan, loosely translated as 7 feasts, but also known as the 7 labors, We'll come back to the significance of this title later. These travels are prompted by the capture of Rostam's king, Kai-Khos. Kai-Khos launched an attack on Mazandaran, the land of the Deevs or the demons. In response, the king of Mazandaran called on the great white demon to come to his aid, and the white demon captured Kai-Khos. Rostam travels alone to rescue the king, accompanied only by his horse Raksh, his faithful companion. As Rostam travels the road to rescue the king, he has 7 adventures or ordeals. First, he's attacked by a huge lion while he is sleeping. Raksh, however, intervenes and kills the lion. By the time Rostam wakes up, the attack is over, and Raksh has to describe it to his master. Next, the hero nearly dies of thirst while crossing a desert, but a ram appears and directs him to an oasis. Third, Rostam is attacked again, this time by a dragon who's guarding the oasis that the ram sent him to. Raksh tries to warn Rostam twice, but Rostam tells Raksh to let him sleep. Finally, Rostam sees the dragon and he kills it with his sword. In the fourth adventure, Rostam comes upon a feast set up near a spring with no one around. Rostam begins to sing about his own adventures, mourning how alone he is. And while he's singing, a beautiful woman appears. He begins to sing of her beauty. He offers her wine, but when he invokes the name of God, her true nature is revealed. She transforms into an ugly, evil woman, and Rostam kills her. Once again, Rostam does not fit our modern-day image of a hero. Slaying a woman just because she turns ugly seems a little harsh. But in the Shahnameh, as in other mythologies, physical appearances are often cues to a figure's character. Under mythological rules of the game, you usually can't trust a superficially beautiful woman who transforms abruptly into an ugly creature. So Rostam's decision to kill her is understandable in his world. In the fifth adventure, Rostam tells his horse Raksh to run free in a wheat field. When the watchman guarding the field complains, Rostam pulls the poor man's ears off. Again, this isn't behavior we expect from modern heroes, but it serves Rostam's purposes. Well, the watchman complains to his master, who sends his guard force to capture Rostam. Instead, Rostam kills all the guards, and then he captures the master, forcing him to disclose where Kai-Khos is being held captive. In the sixth adventure, Rostam is finally brought to Kai-Khos. Rostam kills the troops guarding the captive king, and then he begins to plot an escape. In the final episode, Rostam attacks and kills the white demon who's held Kai-Khos captive. Rostam fulfills his role as the king's loyal protector. There are several really interesting features of these adventures. First, note the fantastic qualities of Raksh, Rostam's horse. Raksh can talk, he can fight, and in one famous episode, he's able to see an ant's footprints on a dark cloth from 2 leagues away. We're so accustomed to having extraordinary creatures appear in mythology that we don't really even notice them anymore. But Raksh serves an important function. He's a concrete symbol of Rostam's special status. When Rostam purchases the magical horse, he's told by the horse trader that he should make straight the face of the land of Iran while riding on Raksh. Riding upon him, you will straighten out the world. Rostam and Raksh are bound up with one another, so much so that when Rostam's son Sohrab chooses a horse, he selects Raksh's foal. Like father, like son, even though a magical foal ultimately can't save Sohrab from death by Rostam's own hand. Third, there are some really interesting parallels between Rostam and other heroic figures from ancient mythology. Like the Greek heroes Achilles and Heracles, Rostam is given the choice between a long life without glory or a short life with glory and honor. And like Achilles and Heracles, Rostam chooses a short but honorable life. He declares, "To be killed comes more easily to me than the shame of my staying back in any place of battle." There's one more famous story that I have to tell you. about the battle between Rostam and Esfandiar, the son of Ghoshtas, and the crown prince of Persia. According to the Shahnameh, Esfandiar was also a supporter of Zarathustra and the religion he founded, Zoroastrianism. It's important to note that Ferdowsi, in celebrating Persian heritage, also celebrated Zoroastrianism. Just as he included Parsi terms instead of Arabic whenever he could, he also included Zoroastrian concepts and ideals in the Shahnameh. The figure Esfandiar is presented as a supporter of Zarathustra in the myth, and he's given special status as an almost invincible warrior. Some have argued that Esfandiar represents Zoroastrianism in the epic, created by Ferdowsi as a metaphor for the Zoroastrian worldview. The story of Rostam and Esfandiar is one of the longest stories in the epic poem, and one of the most famous episodes. According to the legend, Esfandiar's father, King Ghoshtas, promised his son the throne if he could stop an invasion in a far-off province of the kingdom. Esfandiar succeeds, and he returns expecting to be given the throne. However, the king is not really anxious to hand over his throne, so he devises ways to put his son off. Now, this is only one of many times in the epic that a father and a son disagree on when the son should ascend the throne. In order to avoid giving up the throne, King Ghoshtas sends his son on another journey, this time to thwart a rebellion in another faraway region. And again, Esfandiar is successful. Finally, Ghoshtas sends his son on a third mission. This time, he asks his son to bring back the famous hero Rostam in chains, claiming that Rostam has been disrespectful to the king, challenging his authority. Now, what makes this request really interesting is that King Ghoshtas has been warned in a prophecy that Rostam will kill Esfandiar, but Esfandiar is completely unaware of this. Initially, Esfandiar refuses to go, arguing that as far as he knows, Rostam has been a loyal servant to the king's household. But Ghoshtas will not change his mind, so Esfandiar, ever the obedient son, sets out to capture Rostam. When Esfandiar reaches Rostam's home, he demands that Rostam surrender into his custody to be led away in chains. Not surprisingly, Rostam refuses, and this leads to a ferocious battle between the two warriors. Initially, Rostam is wounded, and he begs to leave the field of battle to have his wounds tended to. At this time, the Nastiri mystical creature Simurgh gives Rostam counsel. Simurgh is a giant winged creature, usually depicted as a peacock, with the head of a dog and lion claws. She tells Rostam that Esfandiar can only be defeated by a weapon made from the wood of a special tree. Now, conveniently, this tree will also heal Rostam's wounds. Rostam is healed, and then he fashions a double-headed arrow from the tree. Before Rostam returns to the battlefield, though, there's one more twist. Years previously, the prophet Zarathustra had declared that whoever killed Esfandiar would be cursed for the remainder of his life, and after death this person would be condemned to hell. Simurgh warns Rostam about the fate that awaits the man who kills Esfandiar. Rostam considers the curse, but he decides the shame of surrendering in battle is too great. He will not give up. When Rostam returns to the battlefield, he shoots Esfandiar through the eyes, and Esfandiar falls to the ground, fatally wounded. As Esfandiar dies, he reassures Rostam. Esfandiar declares that the ones who killed him were really Simurgh, who gave Rostam the fatal arrow, and his own father, King Ghoshtas, who sent him into battle. Ghoshtas failed his son by failing to fulfill his promise to relinquish the throne. Esfandiar breathes his last, having acquitted Rostam of his murder. Esfandiar's honor is upheld even in death. Bashantan, Esfandiar's brother, leads the army back to King Ghoshtas. Esfandiar's horse is led forward, riderless, and with the saddle reversed, and with its mane and tail cut off, in honor of its missing owner. Esfandiar's armor hangs from the horse's side. When Bashantan comes into the presence of the king, he declares loudly for all to hear, "Neither the Simurgh nor Rostam nor Zal have made an end of Isfandiar, but you alone, or you alone have caused him to perish." Gashtasp's betrayal of his own son is made public. At this point, it's helpful to return to a point I raised earlier. Both Rostam and Isfandiar are credited with Haft Khan tradition. That is a storyline of 7 adventures or ordeals culminating in the successful completion of their tasks. Rostam, as we have seen, was sent to rescue his king from captivity. In the parallel series of adventures before his death, Isfandiar is sent to rescue his sisters, who were also taken captive. Haft Khan, however, literally means 7 feasts or 7 courses, and it doesn't take much research to determine that these stories were originally part of an oral tradition meant to be told by minstrels to guests reclining at a meal. The 7 episodes in Rostam and Isfandiar's quests parallel the 7 courses of an ancient Persian formal banquet meal. The storyteller lays out a 7-course epic spread for the audience to hear, and they feed on the stories of their mythic ancestors. Rostam and the other Shahnameh heroes are far more than entertainment at a banquet, though. They are the meat of ancient Persian culture, presented by the minstrel as spiritual food, strengthening the audience to keep the heroes' stories alive into the present generation. The Book of the Kings includes many more stories, but the stories of Rostam and Isfandiar capture the spirit of the overall epic. It's a tradition that relates the history of a people, but it's also a poem about heroes, valor, and honor. In the epic, Ferdowsi sought to capture the rich culture that he knew in a form that would endure. In one passage he writes, "The houses that are the dwelling of today will sink beneath shower and sunshine to decay, but storm and rain shall never mar the palace that I have built with my poetry." One interpretation argues that Ferdowsi was trying, in this epic poem, to capture the golden days of Persian culture and to pass them on to the next generation. Of course, golden days are often remembered more generously than they actually were, and we know that the stories Ferdowsi's epic records aren't straight history. It may be more accurate to say that Ferdowsi was trying to inspire a new generation by invoking a perfect age that never really existed, but that deserves to be sought after. And of course, the Shahnameh isn't alone in this. We've seen that mythological traditions tend to editorialize about the past. Mythology is never pure history. It's always intended to provide an interpretive lens, instructing the audience on how to make sense of the world. Mythology is meaning-making, value-making, and as such, it often arranges the facts to suit its interpretive purposes. Because of its grand scope and classical Persian language, the Shahnameh is considered a great literary work of ancient Persian culture, if not the greatest Persian literary work, along the lines of Shakespeare. But the Book of Kings is also tremendously influential in day-to-day Iranian culture. Parents name their children after characters in the epic. Grandparents entertain their grandchildren with adventures from the book. In this way, it's much like the Mahabharata in Indian culture. In the foreword to one English translation, the Iranian-American author and scholar Azar Nafisi describes how her father raised her with the adventures of Rostam, Isfandiar, and other characters. This was more than entertainment. Her father argued that Persian culture had no homeland in any geographic space. The Shahnameh was the home for Persians. He said that whenever the Persian people had been attacked or displaced, the poets acted as custodians of ancient Persian history, culture, and language, safeguarding all of it in their poetry. "We have no other home but this," she writes. "The Book of Kings is our home, always." This same writer comments that during the Iran-Iraq War, she took refuge in the pages of this book. She writes that for Persians, the Shahnameh is like their identity papers. When the land is taken away, the Shahnameh proves that the great Persian people still exist. A final note on Ferdowsi. I mentioned earlier that Ferdowsi wrote the Shahnameh in part to raise funds at the rate of 1 gold coin per verse. It was the Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi who agreed to be Ferdowsi's patron. When it came time for the Sultan to pay Ferdowsi for the work he'd completed, however, according to one tradition, the Sultan tried to cheat Ferdowsi, paying him in silver coins instead of gold, in effect paying the poet such a small amount that Ferdowsi was insulted. Later, Ferdowsi moved to another region, and he came under the patronage of a different ruler. At that point, the poet is said to have written the following verses insulting the first sultan. Long years the Shahnameh I toiled to complete, that the king might award me some recompense meet. But nothing, save a heart wrung with grief and despair, did I get from those promises empty as air. Had the sire of the king been some prince of renown, my forehead would surely have been graced by a crown. Were his mother a lady of high pedigree, in silver and gold I'd have stood to the knee. But, being by birth not a prince but a boor, the praised as a noble he could not endure. Ferdowsi eventually returned to Tus, his home city, for the last years of his life, and he died there. A millennium later, he's still remembered and celebrated for this work. In fact, you can visit his mausoleum and a museum in his honor in Tus today. But the most enduring memorial to him is the Book of the Kings itself. It concludes, I've reached the end of this great history, and all the land will fill with talk of me. I shall not die. These seeds I've sown will save my name and reputation from the grave. And men of sense and wisdom will proclaim when I have gone my praises and my fame. I'm always struck by this passage because it reveals how the poet hopes to remain immortal in the works of his pen. The poetry will endure long after the poet and long after the poet's cultural world. As we've seen, the Shahnameh sings the praises of ancient Persian kings and heroes. But indirectly it also praises the poet, the one figure who can make kings and heroes immortal, along with the worlds they inhabited and mastered. 1,000 years after Ferdowsi watched his world begin to change, we have a poetic snapshot to remember it by.